Ahoy and welcome back to another installment of Guns Across the Lakes. My name is Charles Johnson and I'm the educator here at the Erie Maritime Museum in U.S. Brig, Niagara. This week, we focus on the U.S. Navy's Presque Isle squadron after the Battle of Lake Erie, through its 1814 campaign, and onto the eve of the Battle of Mackinac Island. Following the Battle of Lake Erie, Harrison's army followed suit in defeating the British at the Battle of the Thames. With these two engagements, Lake Erie and Detroit were under sole possession of the United States. Almost overnight, Oliver Perry was hailed as a hero in the eyes of citizens across the United States. Celebration within the ranks at Erie, however, quickly faded as the perceived inaction of Jesse Elliott, Perry's second in command at the Battle of Lake Erie, quickly divided those who remained. At the battle, Perry's brig Lawrence sailed directly into the teeth of enemy fire, whereas Niagara, for much of the early portion of the engagement, hung back, away from the bulk of British firepower. Lawrence was all but destroyed, however, Elliott's brig Niagara remained relatively untouched. Many members of the officer cadre believed that Elliott purposely held the brig back. Initially quiet on the subject, Perry wrote that Elliott had served with his customary gallantry on that day. He then ordered that his fellow officers remain quiet on the subject as well. Unfortunately, dissent had traveled out when Lieutenant John Yarnall wrote a letter that would eventually be published in an Ohio newspaper. Word travels quickly through the ranks of any military force, especially one like the early 19th century American Navy. A letter such as Yarnall's could have severely tarnished Elliott's reputation. Ultimately, Perry requested transfer from Erie, and on October 25, 1813, he resigned his command, turning over the Lake Erie squadron to none other than Jesse Elliott. Perry's trip home to Newport, Rhode Island lasted 3 weeks and was prolonged due to being feted by enthusiastic crowds, gifts, and banquets every stop along the way. While Perry was beset by celebration, what he left behind was quite the opposite. Presque Isle Naval Station fell into a state of disrepair and chaos. Ships were left tattered and even sunken in their mooring lines, and on top of that, the Perry-Elliott debate embroiled the men, leading to intense squabbles, duels, and arrests across the station. Furthermore, American losses on the border canceled out the previous season's gains throughout the winter. As the calendar flipped into 1814, the British captured Fort Niagara and destroyed the settlements at Buffalo and Black Rock. With the latter, the Americans lost 2 of the prize vessels, the Little Belt Chipaway, as well as the sloop Trip. Understanding the threat, Elliott wrote to the Secretary of the Navy on the 5th of January 1814 requesting a force of 2,000 militia at Erie until the middle of March as an added layer of precaution. British strategy continued to point toward increasing their presence on the lakes, primarily to ensure their ability to control their holdings as well as supply lines out in the western end of the region, as well as their desire to create a buffer state of native allies along the American border. Furthermore, they schemed to destroy or recapture the vessels they lost at Put in Bay and build a new shipyard in the lakes. Fortunately for the Americans at Presque Isle, the winter of 1813-14 was a mild one, preventing a British crossing the lake due to limited ice coverage. On the other side of the coin, the winter was exceptionally difficult at Erie. Pneumonia and smallpox ravaged the station, killing many, resulting in the anchorage being nicknamed Misery Bay. In April, Chauncey ordered Elliott to prepare the Niagara and Lawrence and proceed into Lake Huron as soon as the ice would permit. For the United States, the strategy was to press on following their supremacy on Lake Erie and retake Fort Mackinac, severing British supply and communication lines with their western allies. Shortly after Chauncey penned this letter to Elliott, the latter requested leave from Presque Isle, and in his place, the U.S. Navy sent Captain Arthur Sinclair to oversee operations at the station. Upon arrival, Sinclair immediately realized the challenge of the task ahead, describing the situation at Erie as being a deplorable one. An audit of the officers and crews showed that there were very few that still remained, and of those that did, most were unfit for service. Expenses and accounts were out of control, and a crime had forced the arrest of many throughout the station. As for the ships, those at Erie were still in dismal shape, nowhere being ready for the campaigning season ahead. Sinclair immediately ordered the remaining prize ships, which were left behind at Put in Bay, to return to Erie for repairs. Paying close attention to British operations, American Secretary of War John Armstrong argued that due to the lack of supplies moving across British lines on Lake Erie, the British were most likely focusing their efforts on the Niagara Peninsula. This resulted in the plans to launch an expedition into Lake Huron being delayed. Back at Erie, Sinclair continued to work diligently to repair the squadron as well as clean up the mess from the months prior, as well as obtain the appropriate amount of supplies and food to sustain the station. Intelligence pointed to a considerable amount of flour and breadstuff in 5 or 6 large manufacturing mills guarded by a small company at Port Dover in Ontario. He sent for Colonel John Campbell to prepare for a joint effort in striking the Port Dover mills. On May 14th, American troops landed at Port Dover, and encountering little resistance, Campbell ordered his landing party to destroy the stores in the area. However, the raid quickly fell into chaos as the landing party began destroying and ransacking homes in the port. Campbell declared the raid as retribution for the British attack on Buffalo 4 months earlier. The British and Canadians, however, were incensed. This raid served as justification for the attacks on the Chesapeake, Washington, D.C., and Baltimore later in the year. Campbell himself was court-martialed, yet acquitted for his actions at Port Dover. Alongside ship repairs, Sinclair began to combat issues with the books as well as personnel who were arrested for trivial causes. Amongst those was Purser McGrath and another officer who threw a volunteer overboard prior to Sinclair's arrival. In late May, Sinclair reported peaceful harmony across his station. However, rumors began to arise that Napoleon had been defeated in Europe, allowing the British to send seasoned veterans to aid their war effort in North America. Focus shifted back to Lake Huron and the impact these reinforcements could have in securing British control of the upper Great Lakes. On June 19th, Sinclair departed Erie with Lawrence, Niagara, Caledonia, Scorpion, and Tigris and arrived at Detroit 2 days later. The passage into Lake Huron was a difficult one. However, the British lacked the manpower and resources necessary to meet the Americans as they entered the lake. For Sinclair and his partner in the Army, Colonel George Croghan, 3 objectives were sent down: seek out and destroy the shipyards at Matchedash, capture St. Joseph Island, and recapture Fort Mackinac. Of their objective at Matchedash, Secretary of War Armstrong stated that British shipbuilding operations must be brought to a halt as the safety of Detroit, command of the lakes, and general security of the frontier depend on it. Sinclair wrote that he struggled with an overall lack of knowledge of the area as well as the flats of Lake St. Clair being less depth than he was informed. The process lasted from the 3rd of July through the 12th. He then remarked that he charted his course towards Matchedash. The issues continued with the fleet. Sinclair reported a lake filled with islands, sunken rocks, and an impenetrable fog, all without the aid of a local pilot. As time wore on, the lack of food and inability to sail the lakes forced Sinclair and Croghan to abandon their search for the shipyards at Matchedash and point their course towards St. Joseph Island. According to the diary of Usher Parsons, the Americans found an abandoned fort. He writes that the fort public buildings were destroyed, found some sheep, and about 40 barrels of rosin were also found. The Americans burned all the structures and by the 26th of July set sail in the direction of Mackinac Island. Parson continued in his diary, "In pursuing the island, we were fired upon by the enemy and returned, off Mackinac Island about 2.5 miles. The events that would ensue following that journal statement from Usher Parsons would become known to history as the Battle of Mackinac Island. For this, we turn it over to our friends at Fort Mackinac State Park as they tell the tale of this pivotal battle in the War of 1812. Thank you so much for joining us here in Erie, and we hope you enjoyed this episode of Guns Across the Lakes. Until next time, huzzah.